Hey there, I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today I'll go over the Makalu climb where one man lied about the summit, and his partner paid the price for it. One man's lie driven by ego and greed replaced 8 years of trust and bond at 27,000 feet, and what it ended up costing his partner on one of the highest summits in the world is so devastating, I'll have to warn you to be prepared for what's coming. It was early April 2017, and Makalu Base Camp sat at roughly 16,700 feet in a remote valley in eastern Nepal. Makalu was the fifth highest mountain on Earth at 2,738 feet and one of the least commercially trafficked 8,000ers. The mountain attracted a particular type of climber, experienced enough to know what they were getting into and independent enough to want something harder than Everest. The spring season was small, roughly 15 climbers spread across 3 expeditions, with a tight weather window expected sometime in mid-May. Among the climbers were Garrett Langley, 44, from Austin, Texas, and Drew Callahan, 39, from Bozeman, Montana. They had been climbing together for 8 years, and this was supposed to be the biggest thing either of them had ever attempted. They met in 2009 at a climbing gym in Denver, where Drew was teaching a lead climbing course, and Garrett had signed up because a coworker dared him to. Garrett was loud, competitive, and immediately annoying to pretty much everyone in the class except Drew, who recognized something in the stubbornness that he thought could be shaped into real climbing ability. They started climbing outdoors together that summer. The friendship worked because they were opposite in basically every way that mattered on a mountain. Garrett was the driver. He picked the objectives, booked the flights, set the timelines. Drew was the brake. He read conditions, managed risk, and quietly steered Garrett away from decisions that would have gotten them killed. Garrett supplied the momentum. Drew supplied the judgment. Without Drew, Garrett probably would have died on a mountain years ago. Without Garrett, Drew probably would have spent his career climbing the same moderate routes. Garrett had genuinely impressive credentials by 2017. He had summited Denali, Aconcagua, and Cho Oyu, which at 26,164 feet was the 6th highest mountain in the world. Drew had summited Amadablam and completed serious alpine routes in Alaska and Patagonia. Between them, they had enough experience to attempt Makalu with Sherpa support. They'd been planning it since Garrett proposed it over beers in Bozeman in 2016. Drew was cautious at first. Makalu was a serious jump, but Garrett argued that between his Cho Oyu summit and Drew's technical ability, they could manage it. Drew agreed on the condition they hire experienced support and follow a conservative plan. I think the part that matters most about their friendship is that Drew genuinely trusted Garrett, not because Garrett was always right, but because in 8 years of climbing together, Garrett had never once lied to him about conditions or his own ability, at least not until the one time it mattered. Their assigned Sherpa was Pasang Dawa, 31, with 3 Makalu summits. Pasang was quiet, efficient, and difficult to read. He met both climbers at base camp during the first week and formed impressions he kept to himself. Drew was technically strong, asked good questions, and listened to answers. Garrett was physically powerful, but carried an intensity Pasang recognized from years of guiding, kinda the type of client whose ego arrived at altitude before their body did. Acclimatization began in mid-April, with rotations to Camp 1 at roughly 19,500 feet and Camp 2 at roughly 21,500 feet. Both climbers handled the lower camps well enough, though Garrett pushed the pace on every rotation in a way that Pasang noted as counterproductive. Acclimatization basically works best when the body is given time to adapt gradually. Garrett treated each rotation like a time trial, arriving at camp winded and depleted when slower movement would have served him way better. Drew acclimatized cleanly. His lighter frame and years of technical climbing gave him an efficiency at altitude that Garrett's raw strength could not match. Above 20,000 feet, the advantages that mattered shifted from power to economy, and Drew's body understood that trade-off intuitively. The first real sign of trouble came during the rotation to Camp 3 at roughly 24,500 feet. Garrett had a rough night, headache and nausea that kept him awake, and the following morning his pace dropped noticeably. He fell behind Drew and Pasang on the descent and arrived at Camp 2 nearly 40 minutes after them. His face had that gray, hollowed quality that altitude produces when the body is working harder than it should. When Drew asked how he was feeling, Garrett said he was fine. Just a slow morning. Pasang watched the exchange and said nothing, but he noticed that Garrett's struggle at Camp 3 altitude didn't match the profile of someone who had summited Cho Oyu 3 years earlier. Camp 3 on Makalu sat at roughly the same altitude as the upper camps on Cho-Oyu. A climber who had functioned well enough to summit that mountain should not have been this compromised at a comparable altitude, unless the 3 years since had been harder on his fitness than he was admitting. Looking back at the accounts, this is the part where I started reading everything differently, because once you notice that gap between Garrett's resume and how his body was actually performing, you can't unnotice it, and it honestly reframes every confident thing he says from this point forward. Over the following 2 weeks, the team completed their acclimatization schedule and rested at base camp waiting for the weather window. Garrett recovered well at lower altitude, and his confidence came back along with his strength. He talked about the summit push with the certainty of someone who had already decided it was going to happen, regardless of what the mountain offered. Drew listened and planned and kept his own assessment quieter. Pasang briefed them both on the summit route. From high camp at approximately 2,300 feet, the route climbed a steep face before gaining the northwest ridge, then followed exposed terrain toward the summit pyramid. The final section involved steep mixed rock and ice and a long summit ridge that in poor visibility could be disorienting. Pasang emphasized turnaround times, oxygen management, and the critical importance of maintaining radio communication if they separated. The weather window opened on May 17th. Forecasts showed conditions holding through early afternoon on the 18th before wind returned, though Pasang warned that ridge-level weather on Makalu could deteriorate faster than the forecasts suggested. The team rested at high camp through the afternoon, melting snow, checking oxygen regulators, going through the gear ritual that precedes every summit attempt. Garrett was visibly energized. Drew was quieter, methodical. They agreed on turnaround times, oxygen thresholds, and communication intervals. The plan was to stay together. They departed high camp at approximately 1 a.m. on May 18th under clear skies with temperatures around -25 degrees Fahrenheit and the moderate wind. 3 other teams were also making attempts, roughly 10 climbers total above high camp that night. The first 5 hours went well. Garrett and Drew moved together through the pre-dawn darkness, the route illuminated by headlamps and a partial moon. They reached the base of the northwest ridge and began the exposed traverse at roughly 26,200 feet by around 4:30 a.m. Drew was moving smoothly. Garrett was working harder for the same pace, his breathing heavier. His rest stops slightly longer, but he was functional and keeping within reasonable distance. Above 26,500 feet, the gap between them began to open. Drew's natural efficiency at altitude pulled him ahead, while Garrett's heavier frame and aggressive energy expenditure during acclimatization were now extracting their cost. Pasang stayed with Garrett, monitoring his pace and oxygen. Drew moved ahead on the fixed ropes, checking in by radio every 20 minutes. The thing about altitude is it doesn't care how strong you are at sea level. Basically just runs its own math on your body, and if the numbers don't work out, no amount of willpower is going to change the answer. And Garrett's numbers were starting to not work out. By approximately 26,800 feet, the gap had widened to nearly 30 minutes. Garrett's pace had slowed to roughly half of what it had been leaving high camp. His crampon placements were becoming less precise, and his oxygen consumption was running ahead of schedule. Pasang told Garrett directly that his pace was not sustainable for a summit attempt and recommended they turn around. Garrett refused. He told Pasang he just needed to find his rhythm. He picked up his radio and called Drew. He told Drew to keep going, that he was moving steady and would catch up, that there was no reason for both of them to slow down. Drew was reluctant. They had planned to summit together. Garrett insisted. He said he would radio when he reached the summit ridge, and they would meet somewhere on the descent. Drew continued upward alone. Pasang radioed the expedition leader at high camp to report the split. The leader radioed Drew directly, informed him he was now unaccompanied above 26,800 feet, and asked if a second Sherpa could be sent up. None were available. The other support staff were committed to other teams. Drew acknowledged the situation and chose to continue. Pasang stayed with Garrett. Honestly, the split is the part I keep replaying because Drew's instinct was to wait, and if Garrett had just said "I'm done," I think Drew turns around too, and they both go home. But Garrett couldn't say those words, and that inability to be honest, pretty much where the whole thing breaks. For the next 45 minutes, Garrett continued climbing. His pace deteriorated further. By approximately 27,000 feet, he was barely moving, each step requiring a concentration and effort that left nothing for awareness of his surroundings. The visibility had begun deteriorating as clouds built along the ridge. Wind increased. The clear conditions from departure were being replaced by something grayer and less certain. At approximately 27,050 feet, the ridge broadened slightly near a rocky outcrop. In the thickening cloud, the terrain ahead disappeared into gray. Garrett stopped. He leaned on his ice axe and looked around at a landscape he could barely see. Pasang told him again that they needed to descend immediately. This was not the summit. The summit was still roughly 800 feet above them, and at his current pace that could mean another 2 to 3 hours of climbing in worsening conditions. Garrett knew Pasang was right, could feel it in his legs, in his breathing, in the way his thoughts were arriving slightly slower than they should have been. He was done. The mountain had beaten him, and the only thing left to decide was how to communicate that fact. He picked up his radio. What Garrett transmitted to Drew at approximately 8:15 a.m. was that he had reached the upper summit ridge and that conditions from Drew's position looked manageable. He told Drew he was heading down and that Drew should keep pushing because the summit wasn't far from where Drew currently was. None of this was true. Garrett was roughly 800 feet below the summit on a subsidiary section of ridge that experienced Makalu climbers would not mistake for the summit area, because he had never seen them. And the summit, relative to Drew's position, was not close. It was still a significant push that would require time and oxygen Drew's plan did not account for. What I can't get past is that Garrett had basically 8 years of honest friendship with Drew, 8 years of trust built on shared ropes and shared suffering, and he threw all of it away in one radio call because he couldn't handle the idea of his partner hearing him say, "I didn't make it." Pasang heard every word of the transmission. He immediately told Garrett that what he had just said was not accurate and that Drew needed to know. Garrett shook his head and waved him off. Pasang reached for his own radio, but Garrett grabbed his arm. The exchange was short, clumsy, the kind of interaction that happens between two oxygen-depleted people at 27,000 feet, where neither is thinking clearly. They began descending. Roughly 15 minutes into the descent, Pasang radioed the expedition leader and told him what Garrett had transmitted was false, that Garrett had not reached the summit ridge, and that Drew was climbing alone on incorrect information. The expedition leader attempted to reach Drew by radio, but Drew did not respond. Whether he didn't hear the call, was out of range on the upper ridge, or was too focused on climbing to answer, was never established. Pasang later told a journalist that the 15-minute delay between the lie and his report to the leader was the thing he regretted most. It was a judgment call he would revisit for years. Hey, just a quick break to tell you that if you've been enjoying these kinds of deep dives on all things mountaineering, leaving a like and subscribing will help me push out more videos like this. Now back to the video. Drew Callahan received Garrett's radio call at approximately 27,200 feet. He had been considering turning around. The wind was building, visibility had dropped, and his own energy reserves were running lower than he wanted at that altitude. He had been thinking about the turnaround time they had agreed to with Pasang. Then Garrett's voice came through the radio telling him the summit was close and the route was manageable. If Garrett, who had been struggling more than Drew all morning, had made the summit ridge, then Drew was in an even better position. The math suddenly looked different, not because the math had actually changed, but because trust in his best friend overrode the calculations his own body had been running for hours. Drew pushed on. The second wind was real, but it was built on false information. He passed his turnaround time by 15 minutes, then 30, then an hour. Above 27,500 feet, the ridge narrowed and the terrain became more exposed than anything Garrett had described. The wind was now gusting hard enough to require bracing on the fixed rope. The visibility was poor enough that Drew could see maybe 50 feet ahead. Snow was being driven horizontally across the ridge, filling in tracks almost as fast as they were made. The summit should have been right there based on everything Garrett told him. It wasn't. He radioed Garrett at approximately 27,600 feet, asked where exactly the summit was relative to the rocky outcrop Garrett had mentioned. Garrett's answers were vague and slow, delivered from somewhere well below on the descent, his voice carrying the flat quality of someone who knew the questions he was being asked didn't have honest answers. Drew kept climbing, scanning the ridge ahead for something that matched what Garrett described. Nothing matched. The ridge extended into cloud and wind, and there was no summit in sight. The realization arrived not as a single moment, but as a slow accumulation of wrong details. The terrain didn't match. The distances didn't match. The timeline didn't match. Drew stopped on the ridge at approximately 27,650 feet, roughly 200 feet below the true summit, and understood with whatever clarity the altitude still allowed him that Garrett had not been where he said he was. By this point, Drew had been above 27,000 feet for over 3 hours. His supplemental oxygen was running critically low, the reserves calculated for a turnaround that should have happened 90 minutes earlier. The summit was right there, but the oxygen math no longer supported going up or coming down safely. He was basically in the worst possible position, too high to have enough for descent, too depleted to move quickly, and alone on a ridge where the weather was closing in. Drew's realization that the summit was close but unreachable with his remaining oxygen is the part that genuinely keeps me up, because he basically figured out in real time that his best friend had lied to him, and that the lie had put him in a place he probably couldn't get out of. And he had to process both of those things simultaneously while his brain was running on almost nothing. Drew turned around. It was the right decision made far too late. The descent required retracing exposed ridge terrain and deteriorating visibility, with oxygen reserves that were insufficient for the effort. His pace slowed almost immediately. The energy that Garrett's radio call had manufactured was gone, replaced by the real numbers his body had been trying to tell him all morning. Each step downward required the same concentration that ascending had demanded. The ridge was narrow enough and the exposure severe enough that careless foot placement meant a fall with no recovery. The other teams that had been attempting the summit that morning had mostly turned around earlier as conditions worsened, or had already summited and descended ahead of him. By the time Drew began his descent, the upper mountain was nearly empty. Pasang updated the expedition leader that Drew was now descending alone from above 27,500 feet, with critically low oxygen and worsening conditions. A rescue team of 2 Sherpas began preparing to ascend, but the altitude and terrain between High Camp and Drew's position meant reaching him would take hours, even moving as fast as the mountain allowed. Drew's radio calls became less coherent over the next hour. His speech fragmented, his descriptions of his position increasingly vague. At one point, he transmitted something about not being able to feel the fixed rope under his gloves. By now, Pasang had established direct radio contact with Drew and was coaching him from below, telling him to keep moving, to focus on one clip at a time, to not stop. Drew acknowledged intermittently. At approximately 12:40 p.m., Drew's radio went silent at an estimated position of 27,100 feet. The rescue team reached his approximate location nearly 3 hours later and found him roughly 50 feet off the fixed line, sitting against a rock with his pack still on. He had not moved in hours. The cold and oxygen deprivation had done what they always do when the margins disappear. Drew Callahan was 39 years old. He died roughly 700 feet below the true summit of Makalu, on a ridge his best friend had told him was the way to the top. His body was recovered over 2 days by a team of Sherpas in an effort the expedition leader later described as one of the most difficult recoveries he'd ever been involved in. The summit camera he had been carrying was recovered with him. The last photo on it was taken at approximately 27,600 feet, showing nothing but gray cloud and the outline of a ridge extending into obscurity. He had been looking for a summit that should have been there and wasn't. Garrett Langley reached High Camp safely that afternoon. When the expedition leader asked what happened, Garrett told him Drew had pushed too hard and overextended himself, chasing the summit. He described it basically as a tragedy of ambition, a strong climber who wanted it too badly. For the first several weeks after the expedition, this was the accepted narrative. Drew Callahan, ambitious climber, pushed past his limits on Makalu. Tragic but understandable. The climbing community absorbed the story the way it absorbs most altitude deaths, with sadness and a quiet acknowledgement that the mountains take who they take. The first crack in Garrett's account appeared roughly 3 months after the expedition, when Pasang Dawa gave an interview to an outdoor journalism outlet about the Makalu season. Pasang described the radio call in detail, the timing, the content, and the altitude at which it was made. He stated clearly that Garrett had not reached the summit or the summit ridge, and that the information transmitted to Drew was inaccurate. Garrett initially denied Pasang's account. He said he had been on or very near the summit ridge, and that visibility made precise positioning difficult. But the GPS data from the expedition, when examined by other climbers and journalists, showed Garrett's highest logged position at approximately 27,150 feet, recorded at 8:12 a.m., roughly 800 feet below the summit and well below the summit ridge. The radio call to Drew was transmitted 3 minutes later. The math didn't work. Garrett could not have summited and been descending at the time of the radio call. He was climbing, failed to reach the summit, and transmitted false information to his partner while turning around. Other climbers from the expedition remembered hearing fragments of the radio exchanges and noted that the timeline never made sense. One climber, who had been monitoring radio channels from Camp 2, said he'd assumed at the time that Garrett was just confused about his position because of the altitude and poor visibility. The possibility that the call was deliberately misleading hadn't occurred to him until Pasang's account made it unavoidable. Garrett did not respond publicly to the GPS evidence for several months. When he eventually issued a statement through a climbing forum, he acknowledged that he had not reached the summit, but maintained that in his oxygen-depleted state, he had genuinely believed he was close enough that the distinction didn't matter. He said he had not intended to mislead Drew, and that his radio call was meant to encourage his partner, not endanger him. I've sat with this part for a long time, trying to figure out if I believe him. And honestly, I don't think even Garrett knows the real answer to that, like whether the lie was a confused, hypoxic mistake or a deliberate choice made by a man whose ego couldn't survive the radio call where he admitted he failed. And I think the answer is probably somewhere in between, where the altitude and the pride got so tangled together that by the time he picked up the radio, he couldn't tell the difference anymore. The climbing community did not accept the statement. Drew's family did not accept the statement. The evidence, the GPS data, Pasang's testimony, the radio timeline, the altitude discrepancy, all pointed to a transmission that was at minimum recklessly false and at worst deliberately misleading. Drew Callahan's sister published a response saying that Drew had been considering turning around before the radio call and that Garrett's transmission was the reason he kept going. She pointed to text messages Drew had sent from base camp weeks earlier, where he'd expressed concern about Garrett's fitness at altitude and his tendency to downplay when he was struggling. Drew had noticed what Pasang noticed. He just trusted his friend more than he trusted his own instincts. Garrett Langley has not returned to high-altitude climbing. He sold his construction company in 2019 and moved out of Austin. According to people who knew both men, he hasn't spoken publicly about the expedition since his initial statement. The climbing community regards the incident as one of the clearest examples of how trust between climbing partners, the single most important safety system on any mountain, can become the mechanism of death when that trust is based on something that isn't true. Drew Callahan was 39. He came within 200 feet of the summit of the 5th highest mountain on Earth before turning around and died on the descent because his best friend told him it was close when it wasn't. The mountain didn't kill Drew, the lie did. And the man who told it has to live with the fact that the single most important relationship in his climbing life, the one built on 8 years of shared ropes and mutual trust, ended because he couldn't say 3 words into a radio. I didn't make it.